My father stood in court, his voice sharp enough to cut skin. He laughed as he told the judge I had wasted my life, that I had never held a real job. The words burned through me, while strangers chuckled in the back row. I didn't speak. I just held my breath, because I knew one day they would learn who Brooke Townsend really was. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family while others took all the credit? Let me know your story down in the comments. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The humidity in the Savannah federal courtroom was a heavy, physical presence, but I sat perfectly still. My father, Frank, was putting on the performance of a lifetime. At 82 years old, he still had that booming voice, the kind he used to close multi-million-dollar real estate deals. To the judge, he looked like a grieving patriarch trying to manage a failing estate. To me, he looked like a target who had no idea he was already in the crosshairs. He pointed a shaky, dramatic finger at me and told the room I was a failed artist, a girl who spent her days dragging a violin bow across strings for spare change while the family legacy crumbled. I heard the murmurs from the gallery, the socialites of Savannah, people who had known my mother, Teresa, and now looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't even look at him. Instead, I focused on the rhythm of my own lungs. In for 4 counts, out for 6. Tactical breathing. It is a survival mechanism they drill into you when you are operating in high-stress environments where a single erratic heartbeat can give away your position. I wasn't a musician having a breakdown. I was an operative maintaining operational security. My father thought my silence was a sign of defeat. He thought the sensible Brooke, the one who always shrank to let her brother Jackson shine, was finally broken. He was wrong. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I sat there, absorbing the insults as data points for a balance sheet that was about to be settled. Jackson sat behind our father, smirking. At 30 years old, he was the golden son. The developer who was supposed to turn our mother's music conservatory into luxury condos. He looked at me like I was an obstacle to be cleared, a line of bad debt to be written off. He had no idea that my worthless career had been the only thing keeping the roof over his head for over a decade. I glanced at my attorney, Vanessa. She was 69 years old, sharp as a bayonet, and held a manila folder with a heavy red wax seal from the Department of Defense. She looked at me, waiting for the signal. I took one more measured breath. The time for enduring their version of the story was over. It was time for the accounting to begin. I gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. The tactical retreat was finished. Now, we were moving to the extraction. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 12 long years. While my father was hosting lavish dinners in Savannah and Jackson was racking up gambling debts in high-stakes coastal clubs, I was living in a world of dust and static. My reality was measured in mission parameters and extraction windows, miles away from the humidity of Georgia. They saw a daughter who was gone too much, a flake, who could not hold down a real job in their narrow corporate world. They did not realize that my absence was the only thing keeping them from the street. I remember a night at a base in Djibouti. The air was a thick, hot blanket that made your skin crawl. I sat at a terminal, authorizing a wire transfer of $60,000. It was a combination of my annual combat pay, specialized hazard allotments, and high-tier re-enlistment bonuses sent directly to an account my mother had opened in secret. Over 10 years, that number climbed to $600,000. I wasn't buying luxury cars or paying sorority fees. I was paying the property taxes and the mortgage on the music conservatory that my father had forgotten, while chasing another failed real estate pipe dream. He was so blinded by his own crumbling commercial empire that he never noticed the house was clear, assuming the bank was simply deferring to his name, while my mother handled the personal books in silence. I found my mother's secret journals shortly after she passed. Her handwriting was shaky, a frail ghost of the woman who used to lead the church choir. On a yellowed page near the back, she had written, "Mortgage covered. Don't tell Frank. Brooke is the only reason the music still plays." Those words were more valuable than any medal. She hadn't just known I was the one paying the bills. She had built a wall of silence to protect me. She understood that in my world, exposure meant danger. This brings me to the invisible chain I have carried for over a decade. Most people see silence as a sign of weakness or a lack of things to say. They think if you do not defend yourself, it is because you are guilty or fragile. But in the world of special operations, silence is a tactical discipline. It is an operational requirement. You learn to live like a ghost, moving through the shadows so the people you love can sleep in the light. For 12 years, that invisible chain kept my mouth shut, while Jackson mocked my violin hobby, and Frank called me an unemployed burden. It was not that I could not speak, it was that I would not. I was a survivor of a different kind of war, and in that war, you do not reveal your position until the moment you are ready to strike. My family thought they were looking at a victim of their arrogance, but they were actually looking at a sentinel who had been holding the line for them while they slept. I watched Frank adjust his tie on the witness stand, his chest swelling with the fake importance of a man who thinks he is a titan of industry. I looked at the ledger in front of me, not the one on my attorney's desk, but the one in my head. The balance was $600,000 in cash and a lifetime of emotional interest. My father had overdrafted on my compassion years ago. Now, the subscription to my silence had finally expired, and I was about to collect every cent of the debt he owed my mother's memory. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled of old floor wax and Jackson's expensive, desperate cologne. He cornered me near the heavy oak doors while the judge took a 15-minute recess. Jackson was a man who traded in illusions, and right now, his current market value was plummeting. He did not look like a brother. He looked like a vulture whose favorite meal had just developed teeth. He leaned in close, his voice a low, jagged hiss that carried the heat of his own financial ruin. He told me I was ruining a $2.5 million deal for my stupid music hobby. To him, the music conservatory, the place where our mother's soul lived, was just a set of blueprints for luxury condos. He sneered that I was dead weight, an anchor dragging down the family's rise. He informed me that since I had no real job, he and our father had already authorized my eviction from the guest house. My things would be on the curb by midnight, dim with the eyes of a predator, observing a particularly loud and clumsy prey. I noted the slight tremor in his hands and the way his pupils dilated the physiological tells of a man who was already bankrupt, even if his bank account did not know it yet. My brother thought he was an apex developer, but I saw the truth. He was just a small man hiding behind a big name. I did not argue. I did not defend my hobby. I simply stood there, an immovable object in his path, calculating the exact moment his momentum would destroy him. Vanessa appeared then, her heels clicking a rhythmic, lethal cadence on the marble floor. She did not look at Jackson. She looked through him, as if he were a minor accounting error that needed correcting. She handed me a document and then turned her attention to my father's attorney, David. When we returned to our seats, the air in the room had shifted. The whispers from the Savannah elite had turned into a thick, expectant silence. David rose with a practiced, smug smile, arguing that the conservatory had been maintained solely at Frank Townsend's expense and that my claim to the estate was as hollow as my career. He called for an immediate summary judgment to authorize the sale. That was when Vanessa stood. She did not plead for mercy or talk about family bonds, citing a federal subpoena served earlier that month. She requested an in-camera review of my records, a private high-security examination by the judge, away from the public record. She explained that because of the sensitive nature of my unemployment, the court needed to verify my income through classified federal employment channels. I saw my father's jaw tighten as he exchanged a confused glance with Jackson. They were still convinced I was playing a game. They had no idea that while they had been performing as a family, I had been operating as a professional. The judge took the Trident folder and retreated to his chambers. The clock on the wall ticked with clinical precision, counting down the seconds until their carefully curated world finally defaulted. The courtroom felt like a tomb. The hum of the fluorescent lights, which had been a steady drone all morning, now sounded like a scream in the sudden silence. The judge, a man who had seen every legal skirmish Savannah had to offer, stepped back onto the bench with a gravity that made the room grow cold. He held the manila folder with the red wax seal as if it were a live grenade. He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at me with a gaze that held a new, piercing clarity. "Mr. Townsend," the judge began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that left no space for doubt. "This court has completed its private review of the sealed documentation provided by the Department of Defense. It appears there has been a massive, fundamental misunderstanding regarding your daughter's professional history and her contributions to this estate." Frank leaned forward, a smirk still ghosting his lips. He was likely expecting a lecture on my delusions or a dismissal of my fake evidence. He was still playing the role of the Titan, unaware that the stage was about to collapse beneath him. "Verification is confirmed," the judge continued, his syllables sharp and deliberate. "For over a decade, she has served as a Special Operations Intelligence Specialist, seconded to Naval Special Warfare. She was an elite operative, a member of the SEAL community, operating under classified status. The air did not just leave the room. It vanished. It was as if a shockwave had ripped through the pews. Aunt Nora's heavy designer bag thudded against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. David, my father's attorney, stopped mid-motion as his expensive fountain pen dragged a jagged, ugly ink blot across his legal pad. Jackson's face went from an arrogant developer's flush to a sickly, translucent white. He looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years, his pupils did not show greed. They showed pure, unadulterated terror. I remained seated, my hands folded, my pulse a steady 60 beats per minute. I did not need to gloat. The truth, once spoken by the state, had a lethality that my violin never could. I watched the smirks on the faces of the Savannah socialites in the back row evaporate. They realized they were not sitting in a room with a failure. They were sitting next to a predator who had operated in shadows where their vacations never reached. At the very back of the room, George, the old veteran who had watched every minute of this charade in silence, slowly stood up. He adjusted his cap, straightened his spine with a rhythmic click, and raised his hand to his brow. He gave me a crisp, silent military salute. He did not say a word, but in that gesture, he gave me back my name. He recognized a comrade where everyone else had seen an anchor. My father looked like he had shrunk in his chair. The bravado he wore like armor was gone, leaving only a small man in an expensive suit that suddenly looked 3 sizes too large. For 12 years, he had written a story about my uselessness to cover his own defaults. Now, the state had rewritten the ending. I felt the invisible chain I had carried since Djibouti finally snap. I was standing in the light, and for the first time, my family was the one trapped in the shadows. The silence in the room was no longer a sign of shock. It was a vacuum of power. I watched my brother, Jackson, stare at his hands as if they did not belong to him. He was right to be afraid. Those were the same hands that had signed my name while I was 10,000 miles away, serving in a world he could not even imagine. Vanessa did not give them time to breathe. She pulled a second set of documents from her briefcase, these ones stamped with the seal of a federal credit union. She explained to the court that while I was deployed, Jackson had discovered one of my military pay accounts. He assumed I was a ghost, a sister who would never return to check the ledger. He had forged my signature to withdraw $150,000 to cover his own failing real estate debts. The judge's eyes narrowed as he reviewed the forensic signature analysis. The civil dispute over the house had just transformed into a criminal investigation for forgery and grand larceny. My father, Frank, lunged to his feet, his face a mottled purple. He did not defend his son's honor. He did not deny the theft. Instead, he began to plead for family mercy and blood loyalty. This was the moment his illusion of the empty wallet finally shattered. For years, Frank had carried himself like a king, using the status of a wealthy Savannah mogul to look down on me. But as the numbers were laid bare, everyone in the room saw the truth. His status was a rental. He had been using my combat pay to fund the very lifestyle he used as a weapon to call me worthless. He was a man with a heavy title and an empty vault. Without my secret contributions, his power was just smoke. Frank's voice was raw as he begged me to think of the family name. I looked at him, and I did not feel anger. I felt clarity. I reached into my own folder and produced a final legal document. It was a specific clause in my mother's will that Frank had clearly overlooked. It stated that if my father was ever found in violation of financial management or fiduciary duty, the legal control of the entire estate would immediately revert to me. I walked across the floorboards that I had paid for with a dozen years of my life. I handed him a single, folded sheet of paper. It was not an apology. It was an eviction notice. He looked at the paper, then at me, his mouth working, but no sound coming out. I have spent more than 10 years protecting strangers in places you will never see, I said, my voice clinical and unshaken. Now, I am protecting my mother's legacy from you. I watched the last of his arrogance evaporate. Jackson was already being escorted out by the bailiffs for questioning. My brother was a thief, and my father was a fraud. The accounting was finished. The debt was paid in full. The final gavel strike did not just end a court session. It closed a theatre. The federal agents were waiting in the hallway for Jackson, and the district attorney was already filing the paperwork for my father's indictment for charity fraud and embezzlement. My brother, the golden son who thought he could forge a life out of my combat pay, was being led away in handcuffs. Frank stood there, his face a map of ruin, realizing too late that the daughter he called a burden was the only reason he had not been homeless a decade ago. I did not stay to watch them plead. I had already done my accounting, and the balance was zero. I returned to the conservatory as the sun began its slow descent over the Savannah marsh. The house did not feel like a point of contention anymore. It felt like a sanctuary. I sat on the front porch, the same one where I had discovered my mother's secret journals. The yellow light bulb above me hummed with a quiet, steady persistence, casting a golden glow over the weathered grey boards. I picked up my mother's violin. I did not play a song of war or a tactical march. I played the melody she used to hum in the kitchen, the notes rising through the humid Georgia air like a debt finally forgiven. This is the justice of the seed sower. For 12 years, I had been trained to protect, to serve, and to endure in the shadows. I had been a sentinel for strangers, while my own family treated me like an afterthought. But real justice is not just about punishing the people who hurt you. It is about what you plant in the space they used to occupy. I used the $600,000 I had recovered from the secret accounts and the assets from the saved estate to establish the Brooke Townsend Music Scholarship. It would fund the education of students in this town who had the talent, but none of the resources, the invisible ones, like I had been. I realized then that the ultimate revenge was not seeing Frank and Jackson lose everything. It was building something so beautiful that their cruelty became entirely irrelevant. They had built their lives on the illusion of the empty wallet, performing a status they had not earned. I was building a legacy on the truth of who I actually was. As the last note of the violin faded into the evening, I heard the crunch of gravel. George, the old veteran who had sat in the back of the courtroom every single day, walked up to the edge of the porch. He did not mention the SEALs or the classified missions. He did not ask for a story. He just looked at me with the eyes of someone who truly saw me, not as a musician or a disappointment, but as a sister in arms. "Welcome home, comrade," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "Thank you, George," I replied, feeling a weight lift that I had not even known I was still carrying. "It is good to be back." He gave a small, respectful nod and walked away into the twilight. I stayed there on the porch, safe in my mother's memory and my own truth. The Sentinel's watch was over. I had my name back. I had my honor. And for the first time in my life, the light was left on just for me. If this story of Brooke reminded you that your true value is written by your actions and not the words of people who try to keep you small, hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe to our community for more stories of justice and resilience.